All right, folks. Welcome to our 2025 Prescribed Fire Refresher. My name is Brian Teeter. I'm the Prescribed Fire Coordinator here in the state of Nebraska with Pheasants Forever, Quail Forever. And we started doing this refresher, I think, back in 2022. So, and it's been kind of really helpful to kind of help us gear up for the Prescribed Fire season, even though we've already been doing some burns, but kind of the main chunk of the season in March and April timeframe. So we have a pretty good lineup for you today. We're going to talk about weather, going to talk about safety, health on the fire line, some lessons learned, talk about some good PBA stuff that's happening across the state, and then talk about some burn plans as well. So I think we've got about 2 hours scheduled for this refresher. It may run a little bit long or a little bit short, kind of depending on how questions and stuff like that go. And with that, make sure you keep yourself on mute. There will be a Q&A option on the top of your screen. There should be a Q&A and then also a chat button. Feel free to use either one of those to ask questions, or you can raise a hand. We'll try to make sure that we see that. Rob and Ashley, you guys want to make sure to check for those hands raised and any questions, and let me know when those do pop up. And we'll try to answer those to the best of our ability. And then also the mute button is in that top right hand corner, should be. So if you're not on mute, please mute yourself. So I'm gonna just to take a quick look at the schedule. Here's going to be kind of our agenda. We're going to start off with some weather and then staying healthy on the fire line. And then kind of end it with some burn planning stuff and some spotlight PBAs. And then I'll finish it up toward the end here on talk about some lessons learned, safety, and just kind of some general things. So, all right, with that, our first presenter is going to be Sean Rossi. He is with the National Weather Service out of Hastings, and he's going to give us a little bit of an update on what they're currently thinking about, the forecast for the next month or two, and kind of what they're seeing, and maybe how that can affect us prescribed fire. So, Sean, take it away.
All right, I think my screen should be shared. Can you see that, Brian?
Yeah, we got it.
All right, great. Let me go back there. Thank you for having me today to talk a little bit about the seasonal outlook and fire weather. I've been here at the National Weather Service in Hastings for about 14 years, with the Weather Service a little over 20. This presentation was adapted by something Aaron Mangles put together and gave it another talk here recently, but I did try to put a little spin on it my own. Just a little information about the National Weather Service to start. There's 122 National Weather Service forecast offices that cover the United States, as well as Alaska, Hawaii, and some of the territories of the United States. If you've ever been on 281 just north of Hastings, that's a picture of our office there. We maintain one Weather Service radar that's located down in Blue Hill on the top right there, as well as numerous automated weather stations, cooperative weather stations that take data. And if you've never been inside our office, that's kind of what a typical computer workstation looks like. We have actually about 6 monitors now, so this is a little bit dated, where we can see all sorts of different weather information, including satellite models. And then we also have access to the internet and the suite of products available there. As far as the mission of the National Weather Service goes, it's pretty simple. It's to save lives and protect property, and we do that through the issuance of watches, warnings, advisories, like the warning we had earlier today for snow, and the advisory we have going on for some of our counties now for snow and the cold weather advisory tonight. But fire weather is another aspect of our job. And as we start to warm up, before things green up, fire weather will become a concern again, and we're going to get into some of that here shortly. As far as the Weather Service goes, we're just one of 6 line offices of NOAA, so we're part of the National Oceanic Administration. And these are the other offices. And again, we're just part of that. As a little bit about myself, I did my undergrad at UC Davis, which is located in California. Got my master's at the University of Arizona. I've been a lead forecaster here, like I said, about 14 years, and with the Weather Service over 20. And those are my two sons there. We like to do a lot of outdoor stuff, hiking and camping. And those are just a couple pictures from this last summer. We went to Death Valley, and it was definitely hot there, let me tell you, 127 the day we were there. So as far as today's agenda goes, these are kind of just an overview of what we'll be talking about. We're going to start off with a review kind of this last year and what's leading into the fire weather season, because that does play a role when you have maybe drier or wetter than normal conditions going into the seasons. And we're going to take a seasonal outlook, what we might be expecting here both in the spring and as we get towards the summer and maybe even fall. I have some graphics for that. We're going to go over a little bit about forecast fundamentals, which weather is a part of, is just one of the three sides on the triangle there. And then we're going to go over where you can find some of the information I'm talking about, and then just a few reminders at the end, if you look at stuff on your own, what to keep in mind. So that's kind of the agenda we have. I'm going to try to get through this in about 20 minutes or so, but I have quite a few slides. So try to hold your questions for the end maybe, and I will be able to come back so we can kind of speed through it a little faster. So anyhow, looking back at last winter, this is a snowfall map on the left there, and then a departure from normal on the right. If you remember, last year was a pretty typical winter if you live in south central Nebraska. We saw about 30 inches of snow in the Tri-Cities area, and that was pretty darn close to normal. There were parts of the state, like the northwestern part, that was a little bit below normal, but much of the state of Nebraska, as well as Kansas, had pretty normal snowfall going into spring, which can be a good thing because that gets some moisture recharged into the ground. So that start to 2024, this is a precipitation plot there. The normal line is in brown. The green line is what actually occurred. As I mentioned, we had a pretty normal start as we got into mid-April. You can see the actual precip was pretty much in line with what would be expected at that time. And then we had a very nice spring. It was pretty wet. It's pretty consistent. It lasted all the way through most of July. And then kind of the precipitation just ended. And we were very dry. And that's why you kind of see a flat line in that green line there. As we got into the end of summer and early fall, and that allowed things to dry out pretty quickly. And we actually had a fairly active fall fire weather season. And then we had a little bit of rain in November. That was welcome. It put some moisture into the ground, but then this winter so far, not counting today, has been pretty dry, although today we didn't pick up a whole lot either. Even though we got 4 to 5 inches of snow across most of our area, the liquid equivalent of that was closer to maybe 0.2 of an inch of rain. But anything will take this time of year because it will help us get off to a good start in the spring. Temperature-wise, this is just a graph of the temperatures last year. The records are the top of the red line and the bottom of the blue line there. The average range of temperatures are in brown there, and the purplish color, the bars that go up and down, are what actually occurred. We did have a fairly cold January last year, if you remember. That's where we got some of our snow. We kind of went above normal into February and hung out around normal through most of the spring. Summer was a little on the cooler than normal side. You can see temperatures were kind of in the bottom range of those brown bars there, but then we had a very warm fall as we got close to record territory on numerous occasions, and that warmth extended all the way into mid-November. Then we got a little bit of precipitation. Since then, we've been highly variable. You can see the temperature going up and down, and that's pretty typical of the pattern we're in, which is the La Nina, which I will get into a little bit later. And then to start off 25 here, that kind of up and down pattern has continued. We were pretty cold at the beginning of January, then we warmed up. We dropped down again, and we're dropping down right now for a third time this year already. So that's kind of what's been going on. Precipitation since October, this is just kind of the fall season, has been pretty dry. We did have that little bit of rain in November, which helped, but overall we're on the below normal side of things, kind of in that 50 to 75% range for much of our forecast area. And I should specify our forecast area is these 24 counties in south central Nebraska. We go north to about Ord, we go west to about Gothenburg and Dawson County, we go east to about York, and then down to the state line. We actually go into north central Kansas as well, but they've largely thanks to some better snowfall in January, have seen above normal precipitation down there. Not including today, because I couldn't get that in last night when I put this together. We have seen much below normal snowfall, although today, again, we'll still be below normal, but we won't be quite as brown as that map on the right there shows. Prior to today, we've had anywhere from 3 to 5 inches across our area, and we'll basically double it today. But again, if we want to be close to normal by the end of February, early March, we're going to need about another 20 inches of snow. And right now, we're not seeing any major systems on the horizon, but there will be another small glancing shot of precipitation coming this weekend, mainly favoring southern areas of our forecast area. As far as the red flag warnings go, which some of you might be interested in, this for the entire state of Nebraska, 2024 was a little bit active. As you can see there, it's the third most active since about 2006 when we started keeping track of these statistics. There were a couple other years that were more active than this year, but with that dry fall, we were a little bit active in the fall. And then the spring, even though we had kind of a wet start, before we greened up, we had quite a few parts of the state that had red flag warnings for them. So all that said, with the lack of precipitation, are we in drought? Well, one way to measure drought is the Palmer Drought Severity Index, and this shows it here on this plot. Where the green is wetter than normal, the orangish color is below normal. We were in a drought for about 2 years there, 2022 to 2023. We had that really nice spring this last year where we came out of the drought. And I'll show you some of these maps in a moment. But then recently in the fall and into the winter, we've once again dropped well below normal. We're starting to show some signs of drought stress across the area, which could be a problem as we go forward. So looking at the U.S. Drought Monitor, which does track drought conditions across the entire country, if you look at the state of Nebraska, just about a year ago, early January, much of the northwestern part of the state was drought-free, but there was some significant extreme and exceptional drought in portions of our area. That has since gone away across our area, but that northwestern part of the state, 13 months later, is now in a moderate to severe drought. So things across parts of the state have worsened, and across other parts of the state, they've improved. Just zooming in on Nebraska only, a year ago, 60% of the state was not in drought. Come to the day, over 90% of the state is in drought, different levels. But as you can see, our area is the south central part. We've lost that D3, that extreme and exceptional drought, the D4 that were there. So we've improved, but we're still drier than normal. There are return frequencies on this that kind of abnormally dry is something we'd expect every 1 to 2 years. And when you get to that exceptional drought, that's a category you'd see every 25 to 50 years. So that just kind of gives you an idea of how extreme these categories are. Another way of looking at it, these are just a change in categories. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but it tells the same story. You see improvement across the southeastern part of the state, and then you see that degradation across the central, northern, and northwestern part of the state in drought conditions over the last year. It really has been a seesaw, though. We started off the year in drought. By early summer, we were almost drought-free across the entire state. But like I mentioned, in that precipitation graph you saw for Grand Island there, precipitation really just shut off at the end of July, early August. And that has put us back into drought conditions. So things are drier than normal to start the fire weather season. And we really don't see much change to that going forward. So as we focus on the spring and summer looking ahead, what we look at are teleconnections in the weather business. Those are things that change the position of the jet stream that have larger scale impacts and that can be predicted. There's many of them. ENSO, or El Nino and La Nina, are the two most predictable ones of the bunch. So the Climate Prediction Center, which puts out those long range outlooks, tends to focus on those as we get into those 3-month outlooks. So again, those are the best understood and most predictable. So what are we in now? Right now, we're in a La Nina advisory that actually was declared about a month ago in early January. And we had been below normal in the tropical Pacific, which I'll show you in just a moment prior to that. But we really kind of flipped the switch into La Nina, where the atmosphere and the ocean conditions matched what we'd expect during a typical La Nina. And the plot there on the right of the globe kind of gives you an idea of what happens. And during a La Nina year, that polar jet kind of shifts north a little bit. What that does is it brings cooler air into the northern plains, which can be a little bit variable when you get down to our latitudes, which we've seen those swings, the ups and downs. But overall, we'd expect kind of a near normal to a cooler than normal winter with about normal precipitation, although this winter we have been drier than normal. But there are different flavors of La Nina. Not every single one is the same. So you got to keep that in mind, and I'll show you that in just a moment as well. So what is La Nina, if you've never heard of it? It basically is just the ocean temperatures in the tropical Pacific being below normal. Is defined as a half a degree or less below normal. This box outlines the area where they look at that, and the blues are below normal, the reds are above normal. When temperatures are above normal, that would be a El Nino condition or El Nino event. When they're below normal, it's a La Nina event. And those change in those ocean temperatures really change that track of the jet stream. And it sets up an underlying pattern of what we could expect. There's three different phases: the warm phase, the neutral phase, and the cool phase. Right now, again, we're in that cool phase. But one thing to keep in mind, La Nina is not the only thing that drives the weather. There's other more short-term things that impact the weather. So even though we expect that plot I showed you on the previous page, there will be fluctuations in that. And in fact, during La Nina years, we see wider fluctuations than during the neutral and El Nino years. So this right here is just a plot of ocean temperatures to give you kind of a feel for what they've been doing over the past 40 years or so. They do fluctuate between the warm phases and the cool phases. Sometimes those cool phases hang around for several years. We had a 3-year La Nina event there that hung around just a few years ago. Then we went to El Nino this past year where temperatures were above normal. And now we're back into the La Nina territory, which will tell us something about the future forecast as we get into the spring and the summer months. So these right here are just what are known as composites. They give you an idea of what's happened in past years where there have been, in this case, La Nina events. And what they show here is there's quite a bit of variability. Now, there's some similarities in these plots, but there's also quite a bit of variability. There's some years where it's very cold, like this 1949 to 1950 across the northern plains, or even across the whole country, as we saw in 1984 and 1985. But then on the reverse side, there are some years where we're actually above normal and temperature-wise during La Nina years. So it's not a guarantee. Like I said, there's other things that play into the weather that actually occurs, but it does set up that underlying pattern where we can expect. And when you average it all out, there is statistical significance, and there are reasons to believe that the future will be what I'm going to show you here in just a few minutes. And precipitation-wise, it's even more variable. La Nina is known to affect especially the Pacific Northwest and then kind of the Mississippi and Missouri River valleys, giving them above normal precipitation. Elsewhere, it's a little bit more variable. But even that, there are years where it's dry in those areas. We expect it to be wet. So it's not a slam dunk. It's not certain. But when you average it all together, again, there is some statistical significance that would set up a pattern like this, and it's based on the jet stream being relocated. So going back to those red flag warnings I showed you a few minutes ago, have they been impacted by La Nina years that we're expecting? Well, as you can see here, over the last 20 years or so, La Nina years have been fairly active when it comes to red flag warnings. So it's possible that this next year, as we go into La Nina, we might see an above normal or an active fire weather season. And that wouldn't be shocking considering we're going into the season on the drier side of normal. So the fuels out there, the stress on the vegetation will already be present. So that alone could lead to a more active fire weather season. As far as how long La Nina is going to last, La Nina tends to have its biggest impacts during the winter months, but it does still impact the spring months. Right now it is peaking. These are 3-month periods, so this would be December, January, February, followed by January, February, March. We're peaking in those periods, but it is favored until we get to kind of the mid to late spring, and then the neutral, those gray bars kind of take over, and that's kind of what the thinking is that we'll have La Nina persisting into mid to late spring, and then we'll transition to kind of neutral conditions for the summer. And then the fall is kind of mixed. There's some models showing that we're going to flip over to a El Nino next fall, and there's some that are showing that we're going to possibly just remain neutral or even go back to a La Nina for a second year in a row, which again isn't unprecedented. We had 3 years in a row just a couple years ago of similar oceanic conditions that set up across the tropical Pacific. So what about spring and severe weather and what we might expect during La Nina years? There is a correlation to that. So La Nina maps are on the right there. The purples are above normal activity. So this is for tornadoes, hail, and severe type storms. There has been research done on that, and that above normal extends kind of from the southern and central plains on up across our area. So it could be an active spring. So that could help out with some of that precipitation deficit we're starting the spring with, but it's not a guarantee. We're on the weaker side. The much stronger signal is obviously further south of us there. As I mentioned early on, when I showed you the plotted temperatures at the very beginning, temperatures tend to be very variable during La Nina years, and that has to do with that northern polar jet stream kind of coming down, dipping across Nebraska, and then pulling up the north and then dipping down again. This is the forecast for temperatures over the next 2 weeks. Normal highs are depicted in red there, normal lows are depicted in blue, and you can see on average, we're going to be below normal for the next week to 10 days, but there's going to be quite a bit of fluctuation in that. And then we're going to warm up again, maybe towards the end of the month, but then we're going to quickly drop back down. So it's kind of a roller coaster in temperatures, and that is pretty typical. And obviously, temperatures are impacted by things such as snow cover as well. So now that we have some snow on the ground, that's also going to keep things on the cooler basis and help temperatures stay below normal, maybe even come down a little bit from what you see here until the snow does start to melt. So now the outlook, what we might be expecting this spring and on into the fall of next year. These are the seasonal outlooks produced by the Climate Prediction Center. These are 3-month outlooks. So the one on the left is for precipitation for the months of February, March, and April. So we're already partway into that. Temperatures are on the right there. Very typical La Nina pattern here. You kind of got that below normal temperature streak extending down into Nebraska, associated with that polar jet dipping down here. And then the precipitation signal is classic La Nina. You have that above normal precipitation favored in the Pacific Northwest. And then as you get down into the Mississippi River Valley on up into the Great Lakes area, above normal precipitation is favored. And we're kind of caught in the middle. We're kind of near that equal chance area, but slightly leaning towards below normal precipitation. This not only takes into account La Nina conditions, but it also takes in just long range model data output as well as trends. So that long-term trend of precipitation and temperatures that we've seen in the data over the past couple of decades. As we go forward, as we look into March, April, May, so here we're getting into more of the spring months. What we're seeing here is those drier than normal conditions extending into the western part of Nebraska and even into some of the south central part of the state, with equal normal chances for above normal temperatures, below normal temperatures, or near normal temperatures. It doesn't mean temperatures will be average. It's just saying that the probability is highest. There's no high probability for it to be warmer or colder than normal or normal itself. There's equal chance for it to fall anywhere in those 3 terciles, which is how the Climate Prediction Center does their outlooks. And then as we get into the summer months, this would be June, July, and August. What we're seeing here is much of the West is favored to have above normal temperatures, along with below normal precipitation extending into the central part of the country. So things don't look that great as we get into the spring, the summer months. We are looking at lean towards drier than normal conditions continuing. And again, we started drier than normal. Temperature-wise, we're going to start off cooler than normal and probably have about equal chances of being above, near, or below normal as we get towards late spring and summer. So what about fire weather potential? If you've never seen these maps before, these are from the National Interagency Coordination Center. They're just showing wildfire potential going into the months ahead. They only extend out 3 months, so it would be for maybe 4 months. But the ones I pulled last night were for March and April. Doesn't show a whole lot for our neck of the woods. It's showing near average fire weather conditions for our area. As we get into March, with snow cover, obviously fire weather conditions will be low if we hang on to it. As we start to get into spring into April, if we do start off dry, I wouldn't be surprised if we start to see a higher potential across our area for fire weather concerns. So the overall takeaways, spring is probably going to be a little bit more active as we're starting off on the drier side of normal. Northwestern Nebraska, which is in the higher drought categories that have seen a longer period of below normal precipitation, could see even more active conditions than the central part of the state. There's not a lot of signals for above normal moisture, so without that moisture, wildfires could be active this spring. As we get into the late summer and the fall, fuel growth from the last year or so, especially last spring when we had a lot of precip, is there. So if it dries out, there's going to be plenty of fuel for fires to occur. So the windows for burning might be on the lower side this year. So as far as some of the forecast tools and fundamentals, I'll try to go through these pretty quick. This is kind of what we look at and what you can find when it comes to weather forecasting. Weather is one of the three sides of that triangle. When it comes to weather, the most impactful elements for fire weather are the relative humidity, the wind speed, and the wind direction for that matter, temperature and precipitation. Those all play a role in fire weather conditions and something we focus on. For the short term, we're talking about that 0 to 36 hour time period. That's when we're fine tuning the forecast based on the very detailed short-term forecast models that we have, and that's where the dynamics of the atmosphere really come into play. When you look at that longer term, when you go out, from 2.5 to days to weeks or months or even years, you look at more broad scale things. You look at those patterns like La Nina or the other teleconnections, if they might be valid at a particular time. And you look at the long-term changes and trends as well, and you incorporate all those things into your forecast to come up with that. So they tend to be more probabilistic, where the short term tends to be a little bit more deterministic. As far as that short term goes, the first thing we do is we're looking at an analysis of that very fine mesoscale data. We're looking at observations across our areas, satellite data, which has really improved over the past few years. If there's weather ongoing, we're looking at radar. We're also looking at webcams. Those are all kind of the immediate things. The forecast models tend to be very high resolution in that short-term period. The finer the resolution, the more computing power it takes, and that's why we don't use very high resolution models as you get into those extended periods. There are some limitations in those short terms. I'm going to show you a couple plots up here in a minute, because even though they're mesoscale models and they're very very fine-tuned compared to the larger scale global models, they still can't pick out every little detail. The kilometer size of the grids are on the order of 1 to 2 kilometers for the most detailed models. And when you're talking about boxes 2 kilometers wide, you are smoothing out a lot of terrain, and you're smoothing out a lot of other factors. All the models are publicly available if this presentation is shared afterwards, or if you just want to look up the information yourself, you can go to the College to the Page, NextLab, or Pivotal Weather. They all provide free weather model data that you can look at. We look at some of that here in the office, as well as some of our internal stuff as well. For long terms, we're looking more at ensembles. This is the day 2 on off to a week or more. We're looking at different runs of the models. They're initiated multiple times with different perturbations, and it kind of gives us an idea if the atmosphere changes just a little bit one way or another, what we might expect and the differences in those solutions. So it's just kind of a more general outlook as you get beyond 2 days. There's also something known as a cluster analysis. Those are analysis that will put systems in particular locations and different times, and you can kind of see the different placement of the low pressures here in this plot. Just gives us an idea of the uncertainty in the solutions of the models. As you get further out, there's more uncertainty, and that's why we talk in probabilities. That's why we are very probabilistic as we go out several days and beyond. And in fact, that's really evident as you go to those very long range outlooks that CPC produces. They only go 3 categories of probabilistic, that above normal, below normal, near normal, which some people complain about, but it does add some value to people looking at those, but it's not going beyond what we know. And that's the thing. We don't want to pretend that we know more than we do. We want to keep it to what is probable. If you've never been to our webpage before, this is just a snapshot of it I took last night with the winter storm warning and the winter weather advisories that are out right now. You can go to weather.gov/gid there. That will take you there. If you want to go directly to our fire weather page, there's a QR code here on the bottom that you can pull up. Click anywhere on that map in the center there where the top arrow is. You're going to get a pinpointed forecast for a particular location. On that page, you can find an hourly weather forecast that will go out a couple of days, giving you an idea of hour by hour how conditions are changing, how that wind speed is changing, how the wind direction is changing, how the dew points mixing out in the afternoon, how dry or wet we might be. Fire weather forecast, if you don't use that QR code, can be found on the main page there at the bottom, also under the forecast link at the top. And just a reminder, if you are associated with a federal agency or the government, you are also permitted to issue or request a spot forecast. Again, it's for official use only, but you will find that link on our webpage there. As far as some of the Weather Service changes to the fire weather products this year, we have removed the lightning activity level and the Haynes index. It's just products that really aren't as detailed or relevant as we would like anymore. They haven't been replaced by it, but there is an alternative to look at similar things, and that's the hot, dry, windy index at HDWI. You can find that on the net. That's not something we're going to be specifically running here at the local office, but it's something that's derived from the other forecast parameters that we produce. So you will not find this lightning activity level and Haynes index that was there on January 14th anymore. In fact, this is the fire weather forecast from yesterday, and you can see that they have now been removed. So if you missed it, I'm sorry. It's not there anymore. It is there in a couple other products still, but they will be disappearing as well. This is that hourly weather chart you can plot up there, and some of the options. That Haynes index there is still there as of today, but it is going away. It's just a technicality that hasn't gone yet. We're working on it, and it will be removed shortly. One thing we look at when we're producing the forecast is satellite data. Satellite data has improved immensely over the last 5 to 10 years. This is a 1-minute loop, a mesoscale loop of the satellite data last night across the East Coast. It's a very smooth transition of the clouds there. You can see the lower clouds up here in the kind of the bluish shade, and the whitish shade are the higher clouds, so you can see different cloud decks. You can also make out features like the plot here on the right, where you see a very sharp front associated with a cloud, or you see some low clouds behind that front. So if you don't look at satellite data, it's something that's available. It's improved a lot, and it's something that we do on a regular basis, and we'd recommend you look at as well. One thing that we started doing about 5 years ago are hot spots. These are just warmer pixels on the ground being detected by satellite. Oftentimes they're representative of wildfires or even prescribed burns. We'll pick those up as well. We only issue hotspots alerts to our partners, which be the emergency managers and the fire chiefs across our forecast area, when it's a near critical or critical fire weather day. So those would be days we wouldn't be expecting someone to be burning. And this is just an example from December a couple years ago when we had that big fire south of Plainville there. This, however, is a picture from just a few days ago, just to give you an idea of how small a fire can be, especially during the winter months, and be picked up by satellite. This is a wildfire that was sparked along the interstate near York. It was very small when it started. In fact, when it showed up on satellite, this was a day that was near critical. We called the county emergency manager right away, and they were unaware of the fire, and they were able to get there quickly and put it out. So it's just a neat feature we have in the winter. It's a little easier to spot fires because, again, the surrounding ground around that fire is colder than it would be, say, in the summer. So the average temperature of that pixel warms up pretty quickly, and that's how we can see it so easily. But kind of a neat thing we can do with satellite. Just going into a couple of the reminders, if you use that point and click forecast, that pinpointed forecast that I showed you on our webpage, keep in mind if you're using the observation that pops up with it, that observation is one of the sites that we maintain. It's not something that's necessarily close to where you might be planning a burn or burning itself. There is a Nebraska mesonet, which is a little more dense than our network. But really, you're going to need to take some weather observations on your site if you want to know what's happening there, unless you're very close to one of our automated sensors. So this is an example where we clicked on the map on our forecast page, and the Kearney Airport was coming up for the nearest observation, but 7 miles south of Loop City was actually 30 miles away. So probably not representative of what's actually going on at that point, but it's the closest available point. That said, the forecast itself is for that particular point. So that is adjusted, but the actual observations are not. Looking at models again, this is just kind of a reinforcement of what I said earlier. They can't refine everything because you have to compress the atmosphere down into grid points. And those grid points, even at their smallest, are 1 to 2 kilometers wide. And if you were to apply this in a mountainous area, so this is in Wyoming here, you could have spots that are 6,000 feet different in elevation in just a 2.5, 3 kilometer pixel that the models are picking up. So the models can't refine everything, but they do give you a pretty good picture of the general idea. And that also applies here in south central Nebraska. This is a point south of Gothenburg. You can see the relatively flat level terrain just north of the Platte River there. And then south of it, there's some hilly terrain, and that's all in the same weather box. So when a model tries to produce a forecast for that particular point, it is averaging all the outcomes together. And so it will be quite different. Your observation in this area that's a little hilly will probably be different than your observation out here in the flatter farm type ground. If you've never been there, this is just one final thing I wanted to point out. It's a fire weather dashboard. It's a useful weather tool that was developed by the Weather Service office in Duluth, Minnesota, but you can view our data using it. So if you'd like to go there, there's a bookmark on this page as well as a QR code. It will give you kind of a nice color-coded outlook for several days, gives you that max and min relative humidity as we'd expect out a week or so, as well as the wind speed and direction. And then you can also get that hourly forecast down below it, as well as kind of just an overlook of where fronts might be in the positions of those. So that is all I got for today, Brian. That was a lot to fit in. I'm sorry I rushed through it, but I will be happy to take any questions if anyone has them.
Perfect. Thank you, Sean. Any questions anybody has, type them into the chat. Sean, do you know, like, I know that the Haynes index is kind of one of those things where some people like swear by it and some people like don't swear by it, and I've personally myself, like back when I first started burning, I looked at it pretty closely, but then, as I kind of got on, I was like, well, you kind of know, but like, it always seemed that like when there was a level 4 or 5, we tended to get more dust devils, but some of that could be attributed to weather conditions, like the heat, amount of heat and low humidity and stuff like that. Does that hot, dry, windy index, is there any kind of use you think for future prescribed fire, or is that more in like a wildfire type thing where like they're going to be forecasting more of like the really high red flag days, or is that going to be able to show us some, atmospheric stability on more milder prescribed fire condition days for us?
Brian, that's an excellent question. And in short, I don't know.
Okay.
I'm not familiar with it. We've just recently got rid of the Haynes and the lightning activity level. And that's just, it's another tool that's out there, but it's not something the Weather Service itself is actually going to be producing or putting in any of its products.
Okay.
So I don't know. I think time will tell. I think there's probably been some research on it, but I myself have not done any, and I'm not sure how sensitive it is. Apparently it's better.
Sure. Okay.
Otherwise they wouldn't be getting rid of these other products.
Yeah. Yeah, I know it caused a little bit of turmoil, but I think we'll be able to do all right. So, any questions come through the chat? I did want to say we did put together kind of a PDF of links for kind of weather links that we've used in the past. I'm going to throw that into the chat. Maybe if I can figure out how to do it. No, well, I guess I'll figure out how to do it here in a minute. But just has a bunch of different links for those things, and then I'll chat a little bit about some of that in my presentation later. But Sean, really appreciate you giving us kind of a heads up on what we might expect this spring. And the only thing I request is, can we keep the tornadoes away this spring?
Yeah, well, hopefully, right? But we are, the outlook would be for a slightly more active than normal season. So
Yeah.
last year was a little bit more active than we had seen in the years past, and this year could continue that trend. I agree with you, though. I don't need any tornadoes, but I would love some precipitation.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
hopefully
Unfortunately, those kind of come hand in hand, don't they?
in the spring months, yes.
All right, Sean, thank you. We'll move on to our next presenter. Next presenter is going to be Kelly Middlebrandt. She's going to talk about kind of staying healthy on the fire line this spring. One of the things that, we always talk about is, I think, for those that don't know, Aldo Leopold passed away on a prescribed burn of a heart attack. One of my mentors passed away from a heart attack on a prescribed burn. And so there are definitely factors that we want to look out for and make sure that we're, ready for. And so I think she's going to talk to us a little bit about some of those things. She recently got her EMT license. Congratulations, Kelly. So she's going to fill us in on what she learned and hopefully help you come spring.
Thank you. Yeah, and I'll definitely be touching on that topic here. Let me see if I can share my screen. Let's see here. See if I can find it. All right, I'll try to. All right, you guys see that all right?
Yep, we got it.
Perfect. All right. So I'm going to give you guys kind of some insights on how to stay alive on the fire line, and hopefully, if any of your crew members go down with an emergency, give you some tips and tricks to be able to help them until you can get them to the hospital or wherever they need to go. There we go. So a little bit about me. I started my journey with prescribed fire in 2018 when I lived in Wisconsin. So that was my intro to wildland fire, my 130, 190, and my L180 and whatnot. October of 2019, I moved from Wisconsin to Nebraska to work for Pheasants Forever out of the Alliance office. And in June of 23, I made the best decision of my life, joining the Alliance Volunteer Fire Department. And they helped me get through my EMT class, which I started back in August and recently finished up. So I just got that certification in January, and I just got my license number yesterday. So I was really excited to see that come through. So a quick overview of what we're going to be going over. We're going to cover some statistics for some common fire line injury and death causes, some medical emergencies, how to deal with them. We're going to go over heat emergencies, cold emergencies, some dehydration, and some different health emergencies, as well as different injuries like burns, any flesh wounds, breaks, sprains, strains, etc. And then I'm going to give you guys an idea for what I like to put in a first aid kit when I'm getting ready to do fire line activities or different kind of stuff. So I'll let you guys know. So this data came from FEMA and the National Fire Protection Association. I kind of tried to cherry pick and fiddle with some of the data to try to figure out how best to gear it towards prescribed fire, but the way that it's worked out, it's kind of goofy. So this does include career structure fire, volunteer firefighters for both structure and wildland, career wildland fires, and contractor wildland fires as well. So as far as injuries go, over 63,000 firefighters were injured on duty in 2023 in the US, which sounds like a really big number. Thankfully, only 57% of those were strains, sprains, and some muscle injuries. So definitely a word of caution if you're going onto a prescribed fire or if you're on a volunteer fire department, to stay limber, know your limits. Make sure you give a good stretch before going on any burns. And then there were over 1,500 injuries that were caused by vehicle accidents. As far as injuries go, it was only 2%, but on the next slide, we'll kind of talk about how that's a little bit more important going forward. And as far as fatalities between the beginning of 2022 and the end of 2024, there were 263 firefighters that died on duty, and 129 of them, almost 50% of them, were volunteers. So as we're going on these prescribed burns, I believe that we would fall under that volunteer category. And as of January 1st, already 7 firefighters have died in the United States, so we're not off to a good start this year. So as far as causes of death go, the top 4 causes of death, the biggest one that you see here is stress and overexertion, and we'll touch a little bit more into that later. But you can see that that's almost 50%. So just by knowing your limits, hitting the gym, staying healthy, staying fit before you go on some of these fires, can really cut down the number of fatalities that we see every year when it comes to people working on fires. And then here's where that vehicle collision comes in. The second leading cause of fatalities in firefighters is a vehicle or aircraft collision. It's 17% in the last, 2 years. And then 9% struck by, I'm guessing that's vehicle versus firefighter or struck by a tree. And then 7% were caught or trapped. Oh, when I got this, all of this data from this USFA, the United States Fire Administration, from the FEMA.gov website. It's a really cool resource. If you go to that firefighter-fatalities report builder, you can kind of pick and choose the data that you want to look at. So you can look at the fatality rates, all the way back to, the 80s and whatnot. And it's really cool resource to see. All right, and we'll get into the meat and potatoes here. So as far as heat emergencies, I'm sure you all have heard these terms before. So we've got 3 varying levels of heat emergency. You've got your heat stress, heat exhaustion, and heat stroke. Your heat stress, I'm pretty sure everyone on this call has probably experienced heat stress once in their life before. You're going to have warm skin, excessive sweating, probably some cramping, and some mild moderate discomfort. You're going to look probably a little bit like that yellow smiley face, not in a, awful time, but also not exactly having a party. And heat exhaustion, I've had a couple run-ins with this. It's not fun at all. Warm skin, excessive sweating, but you're also going to add on some weakness and fatigue, headaches and dizziness. Last time I had heat exhaustion, I kind of started to get some tunnel vision. My vision started blacking out, nausea, vomiting, and you're at a high risk of fainting. And then heat stroke is going to be your most severe. You're going to have hot, dry skin. Your body is basically given up trying to cool you off because it's gone through those other stages of heat stress, heat exhaustion. Your body's given up on trying to cool you off. You're going to have some altered mental status. Those cramps are going to turn into convulsions, and eventually you're going to lose consciousness as your body kind of goes into power saving mode, essentially. As far as treatment goes, heat stress and heat exhaustion are going to be pretty similar. Getting out of the sun, getting out of the heat. And for heat stress and heat exhaustion, you're going to want to cool down slowly. You don't want to throw your body into shock with a big temperature change. Making sure you're drinking plenty of water and plenty of electrolytes. Making sure that you're not only relying on, your Gatorades, your body armors, whatever your drink of choice is. My rule of thumb is to drink 2 bottles of water per 1 bottle of Gatorade, whatever. And then getting plenty of rest, not moving around too much, because the more you move around, the more you're going to build body heat. And that's something that your body just doesn't need at that moment. And then heat stroke is going to be a little bit different. This is a severe medical emergency. You're going to want to get them out of the sun, get them out of the heat, and cool them down rapidly. Because at this point of heat stroke, your body is so hot that your organs are shutting down. So you're going to want to cool them off as fast as possible in order to minimize that organ damage. And then if you can, it's a little bit difficult out of a pre-hospital, out of the hospital setting, but try to discourage shivering as much as possible, because as you try to cool down their body, they're going to be shivering because of that temperature change, and that shivering is going to build up even more body heat. So that's something to watch out for. And then calling 911 or getting them to a hospital, because that's something that is a severe medical emergency. Cold emergencies, I know probably see a little bit less of this, but if you're ever out on a burn during these winter months, you get some of these drier months where you don't have a lot of snow, you get some nice weather. It's always possible. But as far as frost nip goes, again, I'm pretty sure a lot of you have felt this before. Your skin will turn a little bit of red. It's just going to affect the surface of the skin. You'll get that pins and needles stinging feeling. And then a superficial frostbite, that's going to start working deeper into the tissues. As the blood flow is restricted, your skin will start to turn like a white or pale color, might even turn like a rubbery or waxy appearance. And then as your flesh starts to freeze, your skin will start to get firm, but in a superficial, as you press down on it, the tissue beneath will still stay soft because that interior is still warm. You probably have some pain, tingling, maybe some burning, or some numbness. And when it comes to superficial frostbite, this is where you start seeing those blisters appearing. And then the deep frostbite, this is your stereotypical, fingers are turning black, nose is turning black, maybe blue colors. You might see some other funky colors like gray, maybe pale, maybe yellow, and whatnot. This is going to really start getting into the deeper tissues. Both your skin and your tissue is going to be pretty solid hard, and you're going to be numb throughout because you're pretty much frozen solid. As far as treatment for frostbite and frost nip, the main thing, if you ever run into this, is preventing it from getting worse. And so frost nip will typically resolve on its own without a lot of damage. Like I said, I'm pretty sure a lot of you have dealt with frost nip before. It hurts, it sucks, but there's usually pretty minimal damage. With frostbite, both severe and superficial, medical attention is highly recommended, even just the superficial, depending on where it is, because you're going to want a physician to look at that and figure out. They can kind of determine how much tissue decay is going to be there, and they're going to be able to come up with a treatment plan to figure out how to mitigate the pain and reduce the chance of infection as that tissue essentially decays. If you think that, let's say if your fingers are frostbitten, if you think that they will refreeze, do not rewarm them, because you'll actually create more damage down the line. If your fingers get cold and then you rewarm them and then you refreeze them, it's just going to damage those tissues even more. And then do not use friction to warm any frostbitten skin. So basically, when you get that frostbite, there are ice shards in the moisture in your tissues. And so if you rub on them, then it moves those ice shards and it can create even more damage. If you have any wet clothing, any wet gloves from working with the hose, what have you, making sure that you're removing any of those wet clothing, keeping it dry. And for some of your more serious frostbite, wrapping with a dry sterile gauze if you have it available. If you're wrapping any of the appendages like fingers and toes, making sure that you're placing gauze in between each one just to keep them from sticking together. And as far as hypothermia goes, there's 3 levels of hypothermia. So your mild, You're going to see some shivering, some reduced coordination. I don't know if any of you have, tried to have any fine motion in your hands after they're cold, but you're gonna have some reduced coordination, pale skin, confusion as your body gets cold. Um, the oxygen has a hard time getting through your tissues. You're gonna have a hard time talking, and then the heart rate is going to be elevated, and as well as your breathing, your heart's trying to get warmer blood to your body parts, and so your heart's going to be working overtime. Then moderate hypothermia, you're going to see that shivering start to reduce as your body's kind of given up a little bit. You're going to see some muscle stiffness, cyanosis, that oxygen is really having a hard time getting to your tissues. So your fingers, nose, lips, ears are going to start to turn a blue color. That confusion is going to progress. You're going to reduce the mental status, slurred speech. And at this point, your heart rate's going to go a little bit wonky. You're going to have an abnormal heart rate. And then even a possibility for some hallucinations. And then once you get to that severe hypothermia, so under 82 degrees Fahrenheit, shivering will stop. You'll go basically completely stiff. You'll lose your reflexes, no voluntary motion. You're at a high risk of cardiac arrest. Your heart rate has slowed down so much that it could stop, and they're pretty much going to appear dead. And even if they look dead, still get them to a hospital because their policy is you're not dead until you're warm and dead. So there is still a possibility to bring someone back from this severe hypothermia. As far as treatment for hypothermia, making sure you're moving them to a warm, dry location. If they have any wet clothing, making sure that you're getting that off of them. Covering them with a blanket, making sure the head is covered with that blanket or a hat. I really like having these emergency blankets so that that metallic material will reflect the body heat back onto the person underneath it and will help warm them up, keep them warm. And they're very lightweight, very small. You can easily stick them in a backpack and they're not going to take up that much space. For severe hypothermia, you may require an external heat source. So as you get into moderate and severe hypothermia and your body stops shivering, you stop creating your own heat. So, the material that reflects your body heat back onto you, it's not working with much, so it's not really going to warm you up. So at that point, you're either going to want someone else under there with them so they can use their body heat, or even putting some heat packs on them. But do use heat packs with caution, because if their skin temperature is really warm and you put a hot item on their skin, it could actually burn them. So dehydration, probably going to be pretty common on the fire line as we're working on some of those warmer days around fire. Dry climate, as you sweat, is you're going to lose a lot more water a lot faster. So some of the signs of dehydration, headache, that fatigue, weakness, dizziness. You might have some flushed or red skin. As you urinate, it might be a dark yellow color. And then to treat and prevent this, really focus on prevention, please. Making sure you're drinking water and replenishing those electrolytes, doing that 2-to-1 ratio like I was talking about. Resting, making sure you're not raising your internal temperature, encouraging you to sweat and lose even more moisture in yourself. And then, the day before and the day after, really reducing your intake of caffeine, alcohol, sugar, etc. And as far as treatment goes, if it starts to get really bad and you become severely dehydrated, in a hospital setting, they'll give you IV fluids to replenish those fluids. As far as health emergency goes, some common ones that would be most common on a prescribed burn, I'd say would be any heart conditions, pre-existing heart conditions, asthma. I know a lot of people with diabetes, any previous injuries, any leg injuries, etc. Allergic reactions be a big one. And so the plan of action, if you run into any of these health emergencies, is to notify your burn boss immediately once there is an emergency that comes forth. If you're working with multiple crews and you don't want another crew getting ahead of you, you don't want them sending fire into you, your burn boss should cease that fire advancement, and if necessary, call 911, get someone over there to help. And if patient has any medication for said emergency, if they have something for their heart condition, if they have an inhaler for asthma, if they're allergic to bees and you just burned over a wasp nest and they get stung, they need that EpiPen, they might have one, diabetes if they have insulin, or a candy bar, soda, whatever, making sure that you're helping them with that if you're comfortable. And a big one is going to be keeping yourself calm, as well as keeping the patient calm and comfortable, because if you're panicking, they might start to panic, and you can't be much help if you yourself are panicking or stressing, your head's not in the right space, and whatnot. And some good things to know, some CPR. If you haven't taken a CPR class, Red Cross puts them on, American Heart Association, knowing some basic first aid. And then there's a newer, similar to a CPR class, but it's called Stop the Bleed. And so it's teaching people how to control life-threatening hemorrhaging, and being able to deal with that. And then before any prescribed burns or anything, making sure that the burn boss kind of has an idea of how many EMTs are on the crew, where they're at. If there's more than one, splitting them up evenly between divisions, or if there's only one, then the burn boss will know where they're at. So if there is an emergency, they can run, pick them up, and bring them over. But if you do have any health concerns, any pertinent health conditions, it is really important to communicate that to your burn boss and the crew lead. So if you do have a heart condition, can't do a lot of strenuous activity, maybe you'll be in a vehicle. If you have asthma, they can put you on the upwind side so you're not eating smoke all day, really to reduce the risk of having any of these medical emergencies come forth. So you guys remember I had this pie chart on here earlier in the presentation, and we're really going to start to focus on this big whopping section here. That stress and overexertion is almost at a 50% for the number of fatalities in the last couple of years. And from some of the other pie charts that I've seen, the other data, this number has been rising more and more and more as the years go by. And so big thing when it comes to, so out of those stress and overexertion deaths, there was 128 of them, and 118 of them were cardiovascular events and heart attacks. This is still kind of a studied topic, but there's a growing number of heart issues that are likely tied to the high caffeine and the other stimulant constructions, all these new energy drinks that are coming out, caffeine dependency, etc. So energy drinks have started to be linked to abnormal heart rhythms, heart attacks, heart disease, and sudden cardiac arrest. And I've seen some studies that suggest that consumption of over 400 milligrams of caffeine per day over time can increase your risk of heart disease. And we'll get a little bit more into that as well, because 400 doesn't seem to be a whole bunch until you start seeing how much caffeine is in some of these new and up and coming popular energy drinks that are out there. And a lot of what people are starting to realize is that it's not always the caffeine that's the problem. There's a lot of unregulated stimulants that these companies are putting into these energy drinks where we don't know, how much is a safe level to consume. So things like taurine, niacin, glucuronolactone, they're all naturally occurring energy byproducts in our body. But what we don't really know is to what level, to what extent, and how much we can consume externally without it causing severe damage. Because a lot of things like the taurine, the glucuronolactone, they're starting to figure out that there could be some severe liver damage occurring with those. So going back to that 400 plus milligrams of caffeine per day over time can increase your risk of heart disease. Doesn't sound like a lot until you realize. So your 8-ounce black coffee has, that 80 to 120. I personally am a little bit guilty. I like the Black Rifle coffee espressos, but one of those it's on its own has 200 milligrams. And usually I always drink a black coffee in the morning. And if I have one of those in the later in the afternoon, I'm already starting to get a little close to my limit there. And then they've got the espresso 300s, which are 300 milligrams. So that definitely starts getting you over depending on, how much is in your regular black coffee. I know someone who drinks multiple of those ghosts per day, that's 200 milligrams. If you drink more than 2, you're over that limit and you're at risk for greater heart disease. Bangs have 300 milligrams and they put just about every single other stimulant you can. And then another issue with some of these is that some of these are being advertised as a sports drink. So you can see like the Celsius Heats. It says proven performance on there. Those Celsius Heats have 300 milligrams of caffeine. And then so a lot of where you start seeing these heart attacks is that they drink these high levels of caffeine, high levels of other stimulus, and then they're going and they're adding, higher cardiac output to compensate for higher activity, or if you're going, let's say if you're on a fire line and you had a coffee in the morning, you're dragging, so you're drinking a Celsius or a Bang or a Rockstar or whatever, and then your fire gets away from you and you're running out to try to get the spot fire. You've now added adrenaline to caffeine and other stimulants, and now you're sucking in smoke. And so that decreases your oxygen intake. So your heart is working even harder to make up for that. And at some point, if you have done this to yourself over and over and over again, your heart is eventually going to say, I can't do this anymore. And it's going to give out. So it takes about 24 to 48 hours for someone to get through caffeine withdrawal. If you have a high dependency, it might take a little bit longer, but I highly suggest, if you're in this category of people who are drinking multiple of these per day, taking a weekend to really focus on reducing the amount of caffeine that you intake could potentially save your life one day.
Hey, Kelly, sorry to cut you off for a minute.
Yeah.
Yeah, need you to speed it up just a little bit. We're running way behind. So.
Okay. Yep. I should only have a few left. These injuries should not take very long, so I should be able to wrap it up pretty quick. All right. As far as injuries go, I'm sure a lot of you have heard these first, second, and third degree burns. Your first degree burns are just like your sunburns. It takes about 2 to 3 days to heal. Second degree burns are going to be where you're going to start seeing your blisters. There's going to be a lot of pain and swelling that comes through. This is going to move down to part of the second layer of skin. And then your third degree burns, which destroys both the first and second layer, and may also extend down to muscle and bone. You're going to see that black or white appearance to the skin. And there's often going to be not a lot of pain due to nerve damage on that one. As far as treatment goes, the main thing is going to be stop the burning process, cooling that skin down, making sure that it's not advancing, and then preventing it from getting any worse, not exposing it to the sun, keeping it clean, managing pain. For second degree burns, if you have a lot of blisters over any joints, sensitive areas like your face, neck, any other areas, or if it covers a large surface area, it's really important to seek medical attention on that. And then third degree burns, absolutely get to the hospital. Those have a high risk of infection. Those are severe. You're really going to need to get to a hospital with any third degree burns. As far as injuries goes, your lacerations, if you've got a deep cut or tear, main thing is going to be control the bleeding with pressure. If pressure does not work, if you know how to use a tourniquet, if you're comfortable with it, place a tourniquet. And if you don't have a tourniquet and your bleeding is soaking through that gauze, do not remove that old gauze, stack new on top of it. Otherwise, you could disrupt that clotting process. Avulsions, if you basically have a piece of skin or flesh that creates a flap that's being torn off, put that flap back into place, direct pressure, control the bleeding, and tourniquet if you need it. Amputation, if your buddy's being an idiot, cuts off your finger with a tool, wrap that detached body part in a dry sterile gauze and put it in a cool place. Do not submerge in ice. Don't freeze it. And then controlling bleeding there as well. Kind of same thing with punctures. If it's on an arm or a leg, direct pressure or a tourniquet if you're comfortable. If it's on a shoulder or hip, you can actually pack that wound with gauze. Body cavity, any like chest, abdominal area, you don't want to do that. But if you don't remember any of this when the time comes, if you're kind of freaking out, when in doubt, direct pressure is gonna really help. Penetrating wounds, do not remove. You can use this log cabin method to stabilize the item so it's not moving around and creating more damage, and then just control bleeding as best as you can. These are pretty simple strains and sprains. Rest, ice, compress with a bandage or a wrap. Elevate, probably don't keep walking on it. Don't recommend. Breaks, if you have any splints, if the extremity is unstable, that's always good to use. If tolerated, use an ice pack for pain control and for swelling. Get them into a hospital if something's broken. Dislocations, if you're not trained, you're not comfortable with doing it, don't try to pop anything back in. Stabilize with a splint or a sling and get them to a hospital so that a medical professional can take care of that. All right, so we're at the end here. So this is kind of my quick list of the 7 things that I would absolutely put into a first aid or trauma kit that's basically going to cover about everything that you might need. So you've got your gauze rolls are good for supporting those penetrating objects if you have it, wrapping them around burns. The multi-trauma dressing, if you have severe bleeding that you need to control, that's really good. The magic co-band, self-adhesive tape, horse tape, whatever you like to call it. If you need direct pressure, but you need to also, have an all hands on deck trying to carry someone out of a bad situation, that co-band can help keep that pressure on as well. Always good to have a pair of trauma shears. They can cut through anything, etc. Med tape, always good to have. They work pretty good on blisters too. Additional items, we're not going to go through this too much. Saline solution, if you get something in your eyes, it's always good to have. If you've got burns that you need to rinse off, that's a good to have. Those emergency blankets are always nice to have. If you're in a rural area, they sell some camo ones. Don't get the camo ones. If you need someone in a chopper or something like that to find you, they're not going to see you in a camo bag. Quick clot dressing, it's not ideal for like rapid arterial bleeds, but it's good to have for sure. Gloves if you're working in a dirty environment, and then those hot and cold packs for hypo and hyperthermia. And then these SAM splints are really nice. This is something I want to start putting in mine. So if you break something, I mean, they can kind of be used for anything. They're, soft foam on the outsides, and on the interior, it's a solid piece of aluminum. And so it's malleable when you try to roll it, but then when you work those sides up, then it stiffens up and it works as a pretty good splint. And that's kind of what a basic trauma kit looks like for us medical professionals. But honestly, if you're not a trained EMT or a paramedic, you can only use probably about 25% of this. So I just like to get my own bag, pick and choose what I might need based on what I'm doing that day. Try to think of worst case scenario type situations, and then go from there. You don't need a giant bag like this all the time. All right. Are there any questions on that one?
Yeah, I would throw in after Kelly's, I think that, being prepared for health emergency on the fire line is pretty important for really all of us. Thankfully they don't happen very often. But when they do, they certainly could be a pretty big issue. And I think that, we're probably not as prepared as we should be for those emergencies. And so I consider, getting more training, first aid, EMT, joint volunteer fire departments are all really important. So, all right, Ashley.
All right. Hey, everybody. I'm Ashley Yost, prescribed fire specialist with PF and QF in Nebraska, cover the eastern half of the state, and I'm here to talk to you about site visits and burn planning. Okay, so early in your planning process, hopefully you're doing some level of site or field visit. Before you even go out into the field, I suggest that you look at some imagery on your phone, on the computer, try to point out areas that you think are going to be problems, where you think the potential unit can be, all of that stuff so that you can feel better prepared when you get on the unit itself and you know kind of a plan of action for going into it and not going completely blind. If you are part of an agency or you don't own the land that you're writing this plan for, I really encourage you to include the landowner. It's really valuable time that you can learn from the landowner. No one knows their land like they do. If you are the landowner, I do encourage you to be part of this. You can also learn a lot about prescribed fire and get your questions answered in those moments. As someone that works in private lands, one of the main reasons that I love doing it is those moments with landowners to learn their objectives or what their goals are, how they see things working on their land. So if you have the opportunity to include the landowner, different agency folks, if there are other programs that might be applicable, it's nice to have different perspectives that can be shared as long as you don't have too many people. There's probably a limit of too many voices in the room at once, but including a few is really nice to be able to bounce ideas off of each other. It's really important also to take your time when you're going around a unit. If you rush or you assume that if you've seen half of it, you've seen all of it, that assumption is wrong. Don't be afraid to stop the vehicle, whether it's a UTV or a car, get out and look at things, take pictures like I have later in this slide. It's great to have the landowner drive the unit and you kind of be the passenger because then you can take some notes as you're going. But it's also pretty typical that landowners know where to go and how to get there, so they might drive a little faster than you if you were by yourself. So don't be shy in asking them to take a pause if you feel like you need to get a better look at something. Always bring maps. I usually bring paper maps that I can take notes on, and then the landowner and I can look at together, but also bring some level of app or mapping software on your phone that you can track yourself, and I'll go over some of that a little bit later, but it's nice to have that physical map in front of you to take notes so you can remember when you get back to the office or your house and start making the maps and the plans. Along those same kind of lines, I always take pictures. There are definitely things that you assume you're going to remember about a unit or the fuels or the different hazards, things like that. But how many times I've gotten back into the office and wished I took a picture of something, probably couldn't even count. So you can always delete the picture if you don't end up needing it, but I know the intention is that you're always going to write the plan as soon as you get back into the office, but things come up and sometimes it's weeks after when you're trying to remember what's out there. So make notes, take pictures, make it easier on yourself in the future. And while I encourage people to, that group effort, including the landowner, including other voices, it's also valuable to then maybe take a second trip or maybe go out again right after with the landowner to spend some alone time on the unit. There might be things that you notice when you have more time to sit with it versus having a conversation with everyone in the truck. And you might notice things when you're alone that maybe you didn't when a whole group was there. There are a lot of different questions that you can ask the landowner, and if you are the landowner, here are some questions that you can ask yourself when you're going into burn planning. This is not an exhaustive list. This is just some to get ideas flowing, but their objectives, why they want to burn is really important. Relationships with the neighbors, not only to know whether we can send smoke or over their property, but also maybe it makes sense to go onto their property at some point to either include them into the burn or just for access in general around a tough spot. It's good to be aware of different relationships that already exist, equipment and crew that's available. And I mean that for the burn day itself, but also equipment for prep. So there are times that maybe something is really remote and it's really hard to get a tractor and a mower out to the unit to mow. So that's an obstacle that you need to be aware of beforehand so that you're not trying to rush and make things work last minute. It's also important for burn day to know what kind of water equipment and other equipment that you could use, whether there's a trailer nearby that they can use, and their family, friends, neighbors that they would have available to come and help them out. I mentioned water. Most of that is the water that you can get to the unit itself. So whether that's a tender that they rent from somewhere or a stock tank that they can throw a portable pump in to draft out of, you always want more access to water on burn day than you think you'll need. Hazards and accessibility issues. There are things that there are units that are big enough that you're not going to be able to fully explore every inch of. So there are hazards like brush piles and things like that that maybe aren't super visible to you, hunting blinds that could be hidden, spots that they know are hard to drive. Those are easy for them to list out because they're on their property all the time. That might not be super obvious to you. I think it's really important to ask about what has happened on that ground in the past. So not just how they've grazed it, but also maybe if they've cleared cedar trees on it in the past, or if there has been a new seeding, that kind of thing is also important to know when you're planning and the kind of parameters that you can burn that in. And then also important note is to make sure that you leave space for their concerns and questions. It's happening on their land, so you want to make sure that they're the most comfortable that they could be with that plan. There are many times that I've been sitting trying to write a burn plan. I come to a section and I'm like, man, I didn't write that down, or I didn't take a picture of that. So here's a short list of things that in the past I have missed when I've gone on an initial site visit that I encourage you to pay attention to, but also to maybe write down somewhere so that you don't forget. And a lot of these are related to looking outside the unit and not just focusing on within the mode lines or whatever kind of lines you create. So things like adjacent fuels, you need to know that if it would get out on to the east or whatever direction, what it would be traveling into and how difficult it would be to put that fire out if it does get out of your brakes. And some of that, can be detected by imagery. You can usually tell from an aerial image if something is grass versus crop, but it's harder to tell, and imagery doesn't update enough to tell you whether it was beans that year or corn that year, or how heavily it was grazed, things like that give context when you're on the ground that you can't just tell from imagery. Power lines, sometimes if a unit is on the road or really close to a road, you might not look up when you're traveling out there to see if there's a power line. So that's something to be aware of. A lot of the times when you're looking out, you might think about the fuel loading present or how much fuel is there and how it will burn. But maybe you're not looking specifically at species that are there. And in some of the burn plan templates that we use, that is important. It's also really important to remember that each unit is going to be different, and even within the unit, that fuel loading or what's available to burn is going to change. So you need to be cognizant of that and always looking for that. So maybe you go right up to a woodland that has less fuel, and you know that fire won't really carry into that, or it's mostly shaded, so it doesn't grow as thick as maybe out in the full sun. Maybe there's spots that are going to be a really thatchy fire break, or maybe there's shrubs growing, so you know that there's going to be some stems in the fire break that could be hard on tires. Just different things like that to notice. It's not just one uniform unit. It's going to be constantly changing. Accessibility. So it's really easy to go out to a unit and only travel it in one direction. But there are things that maybe you went down a hill that you didn't realize how steep it was, but if you try to go back up that hill would not be easy. So trying your best to be able to travel a unit in both directions. Also, there are units that you go out and you look at it and you're on, say, an ATV or a UTV that can access things pretty easily. You have to think about if a big truck with water would be able to access everything and travel as easy as you do. Different sensitivities to smoke. Hopefully a lot of aerial imageries can help with that, but think about it when you're on the ground. And then hidden hazards, things like brush piles that are buried in the grass or up in some trees that you can't see, things that you have to look a little bit harder. All right, so then after you do your site visit, you get all that information. You're going to sit down and try to put some level of burn plan together. In Nebraska, prescribed fire is regulated by the state legislature. Hopefully all of you are aware of that. To be able to do a prescribed fire, you need to get a written burn permit from your local fire chief. To waive that constant ban that is in effect, usually what is needed to get that permit is some level of burn plan. Each fire chief is going to be different on what their expectations are, so just reach out early and make sure that you are fulfilling those expectations. Another thing that can be really easy is if you write a lot of burn plans, you end up just copying and pasting a lot of information. So I just want to emphasize that each burn unit is unique. So while there might be places that look like you just copy and paste, make sure that you are evaluating each one of those specifically. Or even, if you're new to burn plan writing and you get an example from someone that you're supposed to use to create yours, don't just assume that what they wrote is also going to work for your unit. Make sure to ask questions to clarify that. Things that could come up on the equipment side of things would be you put that it's 1,000-gallon water tender. Maybe they don't have one. They just have a big truck that has 500 gallons, or maybe they don't have access to a water tender. Things on the crew side it depends on so many things about a unit: size, complexity, what the brakes look like, the topography. So that's something that is going to be ever changing, but it's important to know that while a lot of those roles stay the same, depending on how many units and trucks and ATVs and stuff, that number should be different or should be considered for every individual burn plan that you write. And definitely for weather, I think a lot of people think about wind direction and what restrictions they might have for that. But this is one that I put together for a CRP unit, and that fuel loading and that fire behavior that is expected on a plot of land that hasn't been touched in 5 to 10 years is very different than, say, a rangeland example that gets grazed annually and has just been deferred for a year. So in this situation on CRP with really thick grasses, I wanted a little bit more than that 5-mile-an-hour minimum that you might see for wind, because with light and variable winds, those CRP fuels really take over, and the fire is more fuel-based than wind-pushed. And then you can also see that a lot of plans, maybe you would put relative humidity at 20 to 25. I bumped it up to 30 because in this case, it was going to burn, and the risk that's associated with going lower wasn't needed because I had confidence that it could be done safely and reach the objectives with 30%. So another part of a burn plan that's pretty easy just to gloss over and put the same as you did in the past, but make sure you're thinking about that each time. Maybe you want to burn in the summer, so a high of 80-degree temperature wouldn't be high enough. Maybe you'll be burning with higher, so it's always flexible. Contingency planning is huge within prescribed fire. We hope that for the best and we don't want anything to escape, but we need to prepare for the worst. So you need to know what your vulnerable areas are, and then if anything would happen, where you would go if a direct attack wouldn't work, and where you have confidence that you could hold that fire, whether that's roads, really green alfalfa fields, disked or really sparse fuel for crop fields, things like that. Places where you think it would slow down and you would have a better chance of catching it. Sometimes you can map that. This one is an example of a map that included those contingency lines. Sometimes you can just include that in your burn plan. It doesn't matter what you do, but it does matter if you are doing the planning part of it and thinking about it. Burn plan mapping. Mapping is my favorite part of a burn plan, but it's pretty complex and there's a lot of things that you can get sucked down a rabbit hole of people's opinions. Everyone that looks at your plan is probably going to have different opinions on how your map should look. But really what's important is that you keep it simple but informative. You want to tell that story. When someone shows up to your burn, they should be able to look at your map and have a pretty good idea of what they're getting into. So along those lines, you want to only include features that are pertinent to the burn. So if there's a grove of trees that is not a desirable tree that you need to keep, and it's also not one that's close to the line that's going to cause you issues, you probably don't need to include it. It's just going to make the map more complicated. Another one that I used to always include was stock tanks in the middle of the unit. And most of the time you're not going to be drafting out of those, and they're probably pretty bare dirt around or pretty short fuel, so it's not something you need to protect. So it's really just taking up space on your burn plan map that doesn't need to be taken up. It can also be pretty hard with colors, especially like the map on the right is very complex, so you need some way to distinguish the different types of fire breaks and things like that. But really just what you need to be careful with is that you could have someone on your fire that is colorblind. So be aware of that and think about how you could mitigate them not being able to read your map or distinguish different lines. You can maybe use different textures of lines or different patterns to help with that. These maps were both made on fancy GIS software, but they don't have to be. There are plenty of people that take a map and they draw on it with a permanent marker and make photocopies. But like I said, as long as it's informative and it tells the people what they need to know, that's what makes a good map. And if it's clear and can be read. There are some things that you should be considering to put on every map. That is the STANDAL acronym. That stands for scale, title, author, a north arrow, date and time, and legend. I cut off the title on these so that we weren't putting people's information out there. But overall, author and date I might not include on all my maps most of the time because it's associated with a plan that already has that information. But having the scale, north arrow, and legend are really important and are huge in being able to understand what's on a map. And then here are a couple apps that you can be using when you're planning, but also on the fire line itself. A lot of people use Onyx, and it can be helpful during scouting. You can actually track yourself while you're driving around and then export that line that you created and use it on a different mapping software. It also has a web-based app that you can take that off of if you don't want to do that all off of your phone. And then Avenza is an app that you can take a PDF map and put it on there, and then it'll actually show where you are, even if you don't have service. On the day of the burn, if you're on the map and it's geo-referenced, you'll show up as that little blue dot and be able to tell where you are, if you're close to a drop point, etc. And that was all I had.
Thank you, Ashley. That link for Avenza, we did just release a short paper on that on how to utilize that. It is on that same link as above. So if you want to check that out, it is there. So, all right, a couple presentations left. I think we're just going to kind of run through them here. Let's see, Grant is going to be up next, and he is going to just talk to us a little bit about the recent PBA that got started up in his neck of the woods, and some of the accomplishments and really how important it is to get fire on the ground, utilizing those landowner groups. So, Grant, if you are ready.
Yeah, can you hear me all right?
Gotcha.
Okay. Well, first off, my name is Grant Gittison. I'm State Prescribed Burn Specialist for NRCS. I'm located here out of the Ord field office. Before I get started, I heard it was Brian Teeter's birthday, so I'm sure he would appreciate it if everybody on this call would send him an individual email afterwards wishing him a happy birthday. So yeah, I'm going to cover basically the GLW PBA. Yeah, you're welcome. The GLW PBA, which is Garfield, Loop, and Wheeler. We're based out of Erickson. We do a lot of our meetings and kind of our operations out of the Erickson Fire Hall there. They're generous enough and very supportive that they let us kind of use their facilities to meet as a group. Ashley, you can jump in once I start talking about how we got started, since you were a big part of that process, but I'll run through it. And if you have something to add, feel free to do so. This is just an area in the eastern sandhills, kind of butts up to the hard ground to the south. There's been a lot of brush cutting in the area over the years through Pheasants Forever and NRCS, specifically through the Working Lands for Wildlife Fund Code. And Sandhills Task Force has had a big involvement in that as well. Ryan Lodge with Pheasants Forever out of Neely, he's been pivotal in kind of the cedar projects in this area and has set guys up with a chance to be successful with fire. A lot of it has just been focused on the cutting, but always having them conversations of fire as a follow-up treatment. And now that guys are starting to see their money that's not really working anymore, they've spent money cutting the same acres once, twice, 3 times and kind of being forced into fire. They're tired of spending the same money at the same time in the same place. Just another PBA example that kind of got forced into it. Unfortunately, I'm not too aware of any PBAs that have been more proactive with fire and made some good efforts where they didn't really have the problem. They had a chance to get ahead of it. Re-encroachment's inevitable, and that just kind of circles back to, again, just being forced into that. And that's what folks are now seeing, and why they're being successful with fire is because they know it's needed because nothing else has worked. That was kind of the basis for getting started. And then Chad Blado and Ashley Yost with TNC at the time, now with Pheasants Forever, obviously as a prescribed fire specialist covering the eastern part of the state. They kind of stepped in around 2022 to kind of drive home the PBA model and add some functionality and structure to the group of landowners that had an early interest. I didn't really become involved until like the first official meeting where they set the name, the bylaws, and then kind of discussed burn projects. And that kind of took place in January of 2023. My initial interest stemmed as a landowner, knowing that we had fire to get done in the near term, and knowing that that group was going to be my best bet at being successful in our own operation. And plus, I got friends and people that I've worked with for years, part of that group as well. Since my involvement, it's kind of shifted to being on the board. I oversee the logistics of the prescribed fires and send out email notices to members. It's a hard position to get out of. That type of work doesn't really excite anyone else in the group. But I live with it and I enjoy doing it. It's part of my day job, helping PBAs and helping see prescribed fire be successful on private lands. I just hope someday somebody takes that initiative and kind of makes it more of a landowner driven model, being that I do have agency ties to it. All right. Ashley, you have anything to add that I might have missed, or kind of how you seeing it differently? How you kind of got started with that PBA?
No, I don't think I have too much else. Like, it started off pretty well. Like, our first interest meeting had way more people than we expected. So it was just a really great group of landowners. And yeah, not every PBA kind of takes off like they have, but they have been pretty amazing.
Sure. Okay, well, since then, kind of where we've gone, the original intent of the PBA was to focus on 3 eastern Sandhills counties, as I mentioned, that need fire in a bad way, given the level of encroachment that we have around here. Since forming the group in 2023 and getting 2 burn seasons under our belt, our focus has shifted more towards like eastern Garfield, northeastern Valley County, northwestern Greeley County, all of Wheeler, and even far western Boone counties. So the intent of the name GLW, that was selected by the members at the time because it kept it consistent with some of the other groups like GLW 4-H Club. It kind of combined the counties. A lot of them 3 counties do a lot of stuff together. So that's how GLW came about and got decided upon. We might have to reevaluate that given where our focus and intent actually is now, and maybe consider a name change. Maybe tie it towards something a little more landscape driven. Yeah, I see the map that Brian shows up there. That's kind of our focus from where we started to kind of where we're focused now. Current membership, 2023, we probably started with about 20 paying members. Since then, we've grown about 30 or 35 paying members with a lot of agency support. We had good agency support at our last meeting here in January. A lot of people that were interested in learning more about the group, and then kind of had an opportunity to talk about their involvement with fire and how they can kind of play into our success as well. We're starting to see growth and more interest from local surrounding areas. But important to note is just because we have 30 to 35 paying members, that doesn't necessarily mean that we are getting that many folks to show up to every burn. That can kind of be a challenge sometimes. Which is going to kind of lead me into some of the challenges that I've noticed over the last couple of years and kind of that we've had to work through and adapt to. One of those being the volatile fuels and prep work. For the most part, it's been pretty good. People are aware of what adequate prep work should look like. We stress it all the time as far as brush pile distances, cutting stuff, distances, proper fire break locations, widths, all of that stuff. But being a new PBA, trying to get established, working together, trying to gain experience has been interesting on some of the burns. Just due to the fact that we do have those volatile fuel loads and we're kind of forced into burning those acres. A lot of the burns that we find ourselves in have partner agency money tied towards them. And a lot of the brush and fire contracts early on were written by NRCS and our partner staff that kind of had fire as an afterthought and maybe not necessarily the forethought where it needs to be when it comes to brush and fire projects. So some challenge associated with being in areas that have already been cut, no consideration towards fire on the front end, having to address those fuel loads, spend more time, money, or even risk on burn days trying to get through some of that stuff. But they're great teaching moments and they're good confidence builders when you can rip those off with success after a long day. Another thing is developing and growing experience amongst the membership. Getting more consistent involvement from members to have enough help and provide them with the opportunities to learn multiple positions and gain experience and confidence. I personally think we need to get more folks on drip torches, kind of force them into more leadership roles and get comfortable calling the shots on flank or as a burn boss. I'm just concerned that if we have a few more if a few more experienced individuals can't make a burn for whatever reason, or if we had an opportunity to divide and conquer units, split our PBA up and take maybe 2 units in one day to get more accomplished given the workload that we have to do, that those might not necessarily get done because people don't have the confidence to go out there and call the shots on a burn. What else do I have here? What goes along with that's kind of a challenge is people are stuck to what they bring. You know, people want to operate the equipment that they are familiar with, which is understandable, but there comes a time when you need to advance your knowledge and comfort level, especially if you want to advance with fire. And like I said, have those opportunities to be that PBA model where you start somewhere and then you eventually have people branch off of it and kind of start their own, just getting more fire on the ground in the same day. Another challenge is getting people motivated to take on a larger role, such as an officer or a board member. I think there's concern of the perceived commitment that it entails, which really isn't much more than a little bit more time and making sure the group is functioning to high standard according to bylaws that have been set. Organizing one annual meeting per year, reviewing and approving the burn plans amongst members. That's the responsibility of the board to ensure that every burn plan that is endorsed by the GLW PBA is up to the standards that we want to see and going to be a safe and effective burn for our volunteers to show up to and build that confidence with the fire departments. They know if we're going to be burning something, it's going to be prepped to the way that they want to see it and kind of establish that guideline from the beginning. And just simply contributing to more conversation. We're still a fairly new group. Hopeful as time goes on that more people will step forward to take more responsibility and kind of alleviate some of the pressure or some of the workload off the people that have put in the legwork early to get this thing off the ground and keep it going at a high level. One thing that was another challenge that was a pretty big topic during our last meeting here last week was the fairness of equipment being contributed to each fire. PBAs kind of what I've seen have 2 different ways of going about equipment. You've got those PBAs that prefer shared equipment. So their revenue that they produce through membership fees, if they do any fundraising events, they're putting that towards shared equipment to utilize and share amongst the group. There's also PBAs that prefer to have just their individual members are having their own equipment and that's going to be their capacity. And that's how we prefer to operate at GLW. And I'll kind of get into some of the reasons a little bit later. We have some people that are starting to get some big trucks, some 6x6, 2.5, 5-ton trucks. And there's a stark difference in bringing those to every fire compared to showing up with a side-by-side or 4-wheeler. All different types of equipment, they all have a place on the fire line and they're very important. You know, not everyone needs a 6x6 or a 200+ gallon skid unit for a pickup, but the cost to purchase, operate, and maintain those 6x6 trucks is significantly more than the other types of equipment that have been mentioned and have definitely added to the success and confidence of the group. Those pretty invaluable assets to have on a fire in the sandhills country where the infrastructure is not there. If something does go bad, we're burning a lot of open rangeland settings, and having that water capacity and power behind every fire is pretty key for our success. So we just simply kind of reiterated to our membership that just be considerate if you're a landowner and you have these large trucks show up to your burn. Not necessarily paying them, because you kind of walk that line of you're no longer a volunteer if you're accepting money for it, but at least figuring out a way to donate back to at least cover the fuel costs. And that kind of helps mitigate to keep it fair and avoid some of them sometimes touchy subjects when it comes to the conversation amongst members on what's fair and what isn't. In an ideal world, people just see the benefit of good equipment, and it's as simple as I'm bringing good equipment to your fire and we're trading good equipment for good equipment, and then you kind of mitigate a lot of that pressure. So equipment capacity kind of leads me right into that. Like I said, we're privately owned equipment for the most part. I just think it's much easier logistically for storage and maintenance. And then you mitigate the issues of who gets that equipment, what happens to that equipment if PBA does split off into two, or if it falls apart altogether. It's just been huge for everybody to have their own equipment. That way, you know, it gets taken care of. You know who has what. You can know what they're going to bring to each fire. It's helped our success quite a bit. We do have 2 burn cast trailers through the Nebraska Grazing Lands Coalition, I believe, is who funded those or who kind of provided those for us. One's in Erickson at the fire hall, and then we have another one near Taylor. I mentioned we have some members that have 6x6 deuce and a half 5-ton trucks. We have 6 amongst the membership. There's not necessarily 6 on every fire. Some members have 2 apiece, and then some of us have 1. But all in all, across our membership, we have 6 5-ton trucks available. When it comes to 200-gallon pickup skids, we're looking at probably about 11 of those amongst our membership. Side-by skids, roughly 5. 4-wheeler sprayers, kind of sitting around 5 as well. 1,000-gallon water tenders. We have some members that have big tankers, maybe up to 3,000-gallon storage. We have about 4 of those. Those are kind of a challenge to get to every burn because privately owned, you want to get those staged in advance of the fire. So water tenders are something that our group has discussed. If we are going to have shared equipment, that might be something that we go after instead of more suppression equipment. If we can purchase water tenders and have those available to our membership more easily, I think that would be a good thing for us. And then there's various other 4-wheelers and drip torches that are privately owned and provided on every fire. And we're also seeing an increase in membership purchasing their own radios, which is good. We've gone to those Bofang radios. I think Brian has utilized before, and I can program to sync up to the radios that are in the trailer, and it's just handy that people bring those of their own. That way we have more to pass out on burn day if we get a good crowd to show up. Burns completed in 2023, so that was the first year that we kind of functioned as a group. We completed 6 burns, right about 1,300 acres. Last spring we completed 15, which is a big haul. About 4,079 acres was completed last year. And then for this year, for 2025 at our meeting, we had about 15 burns brought forward for consideration. That's going to be over 8,000 acres. So we're on a good trajectory in terms of growth and getting more fire on the ground. After listening to the forecast earlier that was provided for this deal, makes me a little nervous. How do we get 15 burns done in a short window, especially in a dry year? It's hard to do in a wet year, a favorable year for prescribed fire. But we've successfully burned smaller acres, and now people have the confidence and are starting to realize that we need to scale up our units, encourage multi-landowner burns to make a bigger impact against the cedar encroachment. We strive to set up our burn units to be the most feasible and convenient as possible. And we're always thinking about future fire lines into the same fire break locations that we've used for a burn. That way you kind of get a complex setup. You're identifying areas for your first fire, but always thinking about the next fire and how those are going to benefit one another and be able to tie into those same lines. We're having new members joining us that were anti-fire, and we find ourselves burning around and up to their fence the last couple of years in multiple directions. They've now seen the benefit and are now striving to burn roughly 4 sections per year, kind of right in the heart of all the work that we're doing. I remember the first year we did it, we had a slop over, get onto their place, and the landowner was freaking out. We had to put it out as fast as we could, and they were worried that the landowners were going to get back in there and find the black that we burnt a little bit of their place. And now those are the guys showing up to our meetings that want to burn 4 sections a year. So it's kind of interesting to see that growth and change of mentality. And we're putting more interest and focus on growing season burns and fall burns now that people are seeing the workload lined up, like I mentioned. I think that's a key opportunity for us and something that's not really being taken advantage of. And I think it would help lighten that workload a little bit in the spring and provide more opportunities for experience and confidence and just get more fire on the ground in a given year to be successful. I kind of rushed through that pretty quick, but that's the main highlight that I wanted to focus on and get through. I tried to save us some time, but if there's questions, I'll take them.
Yeah, it's pretty cool with all the PBAs that are popping up across the state. I think I've worked with a lot of them, and man, every single one's different. Different personalities, equipment, techniques. Everything is it's kind of cool to see, but it's also kind of frustrating when if you like to see everything kind of go the way it should be. There's sometimes they're not always on the same timeline. Let me see. Yeah. All right, can you see my presentation?
Yeah, I can see it.
Okay. So I just wanted to kind of go over a few things, that I see typically every year um, that we either need to clean up or some things that we need to think about as we move into the kind of the 2025 season. The first thing I wanted to just briefly touch on is just the fuels. Last couple of years we've done this. This is 23 here. You can see kind of where the fuel moisture is at. And then 24, and you can see that we've kind of lost some fuel moisture the last couple of years. And then compared to last year, we're sitting kind of close to the same, but our 10-hour fuels are a little bit drier than they were before. 100-hour fuels, you can see that 22 time frame, we had pretty good moisture the year prior, and we had high fuel moistures. We started losing some last year because we had a really dry spring. And then again, we're still kind of going into that, drier 100-hour fuels, which, when we think about our prescribed fire activities, those heavier fuels, increase our mop up times and potential for escapes after fires. And we need to kind of be mindful of some of those things. And then 1,000-hour fuels, if you look at last year compared to this year, we've gotten a little bit better in the southeast part of the state. And then things are kind of the same out west, which is pretty typical. And we see that kind of through those drought maps as well. So just be considerate if you're planning on burning in woody fuels or you got old piles that burn, just know that, those could catch easier. Maybe it's like a cottonwood tree or something that's, high up top that catches and throws an ember across your line. That could be easier to catch with that lower field moisture. One of the things I talked about last year in terms of at the refresher was using like fall burns or wildfire scars that can be used as fire breaks, black lining out. And we actually did that this year. And a couple of the lessons that I learned from that, and here's where we did it. So this area here on the right is what we burned out. And then we burned basically this side of the hill right into that green part. And one of the things that I learned from that is if you spent your entire life doing prescribed burns or been doing it for a long time, your brain is essentially wired to, check downwind and put in mode lines. And, there was absolutely no chance of this fire jumping onto this green area or blackened area and starting a fire. But I had a hard time turning my brain off a little bit to look downwind and make sure nothing was catching. And so it took a little bit of adjusting to do that, but man, it makes it a lot easier for you to burn into previous burns. And the other thing that we did this year was we did a spring burn, but we also did a summer burn where we burned it into that area. And I think that summer burn or that spring burn and fall burn that we did do, I think that green grass would have held up easily until well into mid-August, before we had to worry about anything drying out. Even if a ember did land in some like fuel that maybe it dried out during that August time frame, it would typically just burn just a little bit and then go out because it didn't have any of that old residual fuel. And so it's a good opportunity to think about, if you have troublesome units or something like that, of utilizing that to burn out. Just, hearing from the National Weather Service about potential dry conditions. there is going, I think we're probably going to be going into that. And we were not saying that, you shouldn't burn and, it's Nebraska. So we're always going to have dry conditions. But, there's already been some issues in this late January, early February timeframe of permit availability. That continued drought could cause problems with you accessing permits. We could see with the lack of snow that we've had this winter, fire behavior could definitely be changed, especially like when it comes to like matting down the fuel. Remember last spring, we ended up having a bunch of snow. And so that matted down a lot of fuel, which affected the fire behavior. So if we don't have that matting down effect, that could increase our fire behavior, but that could also be a good thing. It's not necessarily a bad thing or a good thing, but the same thing with those fuels, I talked about those fuels, those heavier fuels being dried out. Soil moisture can affect that fire behavior, and how fast those, 1 hour fuels dry out if there's not much moisture in the ground. And then, of course, any kind of techniques. So I'll get into it a little bit, but we can adjust our techniques to help prevent some spot fires or slop overs, and just I guess be more mindful as we move into the season about how our technique is being utilized, and think about those issues. And then, of course, timing and objectives. I threw this in here. We did an August burn, and we had really good success on killing cedar trees. So if you missed an opportunity for a spring burn on like an equip or something, if you can figure out a way to keep it deferred through the summer and late July and August, you can maybe try again. Summer burns are, a whole different kind of story. And, we've had some workshops and conversations about that, but they work really well for killing cedar trees. And I would say, I always argue that probably that late spring time frame is probably a really bad time to kill cedar trees, but that, early spring and then that early summer or that mid late summer is really good for killing trees as well. So, think about some of those things, as you're kind of moving into the season, especially, trying to get things done. I always say there's no burn more dangerous than somebody who's supposed to get cost share or fill a contract in a timely manner, because we typically try to skip on stuff or oversee stuff just because we're trying to fulfill a contract obligation. So one of the main things, spot fires don't occur a ton, but we still been seeing quite a bit of those. The big thing with spot fires is that any kind of normal operation that we see on a prescribed fire has the potential to cause a spot fire. But pay particularly close attention to those changes in fire behavior that you're seeing. So it may hit a huge pocket of big blue stem or brush pile or a group of cedar trees. And when those go up and you see those changes, make sure you're following those downwind and they're not causing those spot fires. And make sure you plan those responses during that briefing and planning stage as well to prevent some of that. I always talk about, important to kind of go downwind and check after you ring a fire. I see a tendency of people to kind of like get a fire rung and then they all sit on the upwind side and kind of watch it because it's cool. And I agree. But a lot of times, you got to think about that downwind, because I always talk about the hot and cold zones. So like the hot zone is where you can have hot embers land. So you light a fire and those hot embers always need to be landing in black. But in the cold zones is where you got to look for those spot fires, because if an ember gets up in the atmosphere and lands while it's still hot, it's going to basically cause a spot fire. So watch those zones and making sure that you're, adjusting your techniques in order to prevent, that those embers from jumping your line. This is a really good graphic as well for spot fires. Basically anything above 45% has a really low likelihood of igniting a spot fire. But once you get below that 40% level, your chances increase pretty highly that if a hot ember lands in that receptive fuel is going to start a spot fire. So, thinking about that, if you're burning CRP, I mean, you could burn CRP at like 60, 70% humidity. versus maybe you're going to be burning 20-30% humidity in rangeland, to get better cedar tree kill and stuff like that with maybe some of those lower fuel loads. But just know when we get to that 20 zone, it's a pretty good chance you can have a spot fire develop if one of your embers does end up crossing and landing in there. So in the planning stage or even on the fire, when you get to that stage at 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, it's really important that we have resources positioned in those areas to catch those if they do occur. We always want to make sure we get those spot fires when they're real small, easy to put out. If you start getting a lot of them across the line, make sure you cease ignitions, pare them back quite a bit. You don't want to just keep going and causing more because you're going to eventually run out of resources to do that. And then if you need to reposition water tenders, make sure you have a way in planning or briefing, you have somebody that's identified to actually do that. And then I always like to have those dedicated spotters equipment, built into our burn plans to make sure that, like, hey, your main job is to catch these spot fires downwind if they do occur. The other thing that we see quite a bit, since in Nebraska we rely heavily on mowed vines, is these kind of slop overs, and they're really hard to prevent. But there's a lot of things that we can do to prevent those. Mainly, we're putting down this wet line. Most of the time, what I see is they're putting down the wet line too close to the tall vegetation, and then basically that vegetation falls over and lights something. I've seen other issues where there maybe lines get put in yucca and they sit there and burn forever. Or masticated fire breaks are another issue that we've seen slop overs occur quite a bit in. But again, lighting that, giving yourself that buffer zone at least twice the height, or at least 1.5 times the height of the fuel, get in that middle. It may take you a lot longer to black out this area from the fire to the heavy fuel, but it's going to prevent you a lot of headaches moving forward. And then having contingency plans for those slop overs. We had a nice road here when this one happened. This basically occurred. Essentially what had happened is that this was a mile long section that we were lighting off of. And what had happened is that as they moved forward down this line, lighting this wet line, or lighting off this wet line, they just had a natural tendency to try to drift toward the heavier fuel and eventually got to it and immediately caused a slop. And you can see them, they had them, move out or whatever. So here's some issues with the fire break. There's a lot of thatch in there. It was really tough, and there looks like there's some woody debris in there as well. So just watch those as you're burning. Try to find, when you're laying down your wet line, it's always a good thing to kind of scout ahead a little bit to see where, sometimes you can move in and out into better fuels where there's less thatch or less woody debris or something like that. Fire break prep it seems to be getting a lot better. One thing I'll say about prep and fire breaks is try to get somebody out there prior to burning and get eyes on it. If it's your piece of ground that you're burning, a lot of times you become kind of like fire break blind to how good it is because you probably spent a lot of time on it. So getting other people's eyes on it and making sure everything looks good is a really good idea as well. Backing fires, I know there's a new saying that I say a lot now is that we don't win any awards for getting a fire done fast, because it seems like, we put in these backing fires off these lines and we see people, like, sometimes they just start going after it, and that can end up causing issues. And so taking our time in that backing fire, letting it back off that line a little bit before we start doing our strip head fires can save us a lot of headaches and prevent some of the mop up and patrol people from having to knock down some things like this guy is doing here. Same thing with strip head firing. Watch those bites, the size of the bites that you're taking. You know, initially when you're putting that back fire and doing the first couple strips, it's going to get hot. Yeah, they're going to be really close together, and you can kind of spread it out. But just kind of watch your ignitions and how you're doing. If it's causing discomfort or problems for your patrol and people on the line, slow it down. We're not winning awards for going too fast. We're going faster. Knocking down fires, if they do happen, it's probably one of the things that, some PBAs are real good at because a lot of their members are on the volunteer fire departments. But if you're not, don't have experience knocking down fires, you know, figuring out how to fight those things is really good. Here's a picture we took, like, and a spot fire that initially develops usually is pretty slow, and something like this you can just hose out real quickly, go around it, make sure everything ends out. Versus something that is, starting to get more developed. You might not be able to get in here depending on your equipment and knock down this head fire, so you can start down here at the back part of it and work your way up to the head fire. And as you do that, it takes some energy out of that head fire. So when you get to it, it's a little bit easier to put out. We always recommend trying to fight from the black, but, kind of depending on your skill set and your equipment, in a scenario like this, you could end up, if you have vegetation on your UTV or your truck or your truck's leaking, you could get yourself into a situation where you're fighting from the black, you could start your vehicle on fire. But the other thing you have to think about too is if you're fighting from this grass side, let's say you're working up this east flank here, and you don't get it put out fast enough or good enough, that fire could flare up behind you, and now you're in a situation where you're looking for an exit. So if you do fight from the grass side, make sure you're putting down enough water to knock it down for for a good amount of time. But if not, always be thinking about your exit strategy. So when you're knocking this down, making sure you're looking to your right so you can swing out and around to the right and get out of that fire if it's coming back behind you. It's really important. And then if something gets further developed, beyond this from a spot fire, you're probably looking at like flanking it from two sides. The most important side is kind of where that wind is headed to. So, the one that's kind of turned into more of like the head fire side to knock it down. The other thing with this winter, we did get a good snow in the majority of the state, or at least the southern parts, southwest parts, that hopefully everybody's out burning brush piles today or tomorrow. But we could see, excess brush piles that don't get burned. And if that's the case, those are always cause more problems. So think about moving those further interior if you can't get them burned prior to spring. Brush piles always seem to be a huge problem. The excessive residue problem is always a real tough one too. I seen Oklahoma had a post on their social media page where they had actually used one of those brushes on the front of a skid steer to brush out some of that excessive residue, which is kind of cool. I don't know if we use that, but something that we can look into. And then one of the other things too is when we're writing burn plans, trying to remove these excessive weird dog legs, and try to make burns as round as possible. A lot of times that's going to require us to work with neighbors and other landowners and everything like that. But, being on those burns where you have those weird dog legs, it always takes a ton more time and always causes issues. And so if we can remove those in the planning process, that's a lot better. I always say that probably the most important people on a burn are our patrollers, the ones that are going back and forth on that line and making sure nothing crosses that line. everything inside of a burn's great, but once it gets outside of that line, that's when it becomes a problem. So those patrol and spotters are really, really critical. And on my burns, I always like to have that first crew, spotters, patrollers on the line, pretty close to that engine that's putting out the fire. And then that second or third going back and forth continually on that line, all the way back to the beginning, like constantly. Like they should never just stop and kind of like sit around. I want them kind of constantly going back and forth. And then of course mop up. Mop up is one of the things I think most burns that do get out across the state probably happen afterwards, after everybody leaves, due to piles burning or manure piles, yucca still burning near the line. So making sure that you don't declare a burnout for at least 48 hours longer if we're not getting moisture, we have high winds, low humidity days, or in times of drought like we are right now. Here you can see kind of example of using a harrow to go around. Thing with using a harrow is you typically don't want to be right on that line because it throws debris, so you can throw stuff across your line, which causes issues. But if you go in 10, 15, 20 feet on that line, knock up that stuff, that's going to help you in the long term. Anything really close to that line, you want to utilize the patrollers to kind of use their rakes and their equipment to kick stuff in. But a big thing is just making sure you check your forecast for the next day, the next 3 or 4 days, and always go around your unit multiple times after your burn to make sure everything's out. Drip torches, couple instances, make sure your drip torch cans are labeled, secure them to your vehicle. The drip torches, I have a lessons learned that's coming out where after a burn, we had a bunch of drip torches in the back of my UTV that were leaking everywhere because they weren't closed, and it caught my UTV on fire. Another thing is checking those gaskets. Here's an example of, we had a welder put together these for our burn units. They just attach right to the back of the pumper unit, and they can safely and securely store those drip torches. The gaskets on these torches tend to leak. If they get build-up pressure on the inside, and they can leak on your pants, they can leak in the back of your vehicles. So just be cognizant of those torches leaking in your vehicles. With radios, we want to make sure that radios are fully charged. Make sure they're all on the same channel during the briefing. I've seen people skip these and have radio communication issues. Another thing is if you're work with your local VFD, try to get your local VFD TAC channels or their channels on your radios. Just in case something happens, you can switch over and be able to communicate with each other at that time. Another big thing is wearing that chest harness. I know they're not always the most comfortable, but they do keep your radio secure. Another thing that I've been seeing is a lot of times these briefings that we have tend to go pretty fast, and a lot of that is due to underestimation of how long getting equipment and crew and everybody there ready. So the more you can get all that stuff done prior to the burn before people show up, the better. But if not, always meet earlier than you think. It's usually a good way to make sure that you're not pushing your ignition time back later in the day for that. We did put together this go, no-go checklist that is on that resources that I sent out earlier. And adjusting those nozzles and drip torches prior to getting going so everybody's all on the same page and you have your equipment ready to roll. Water sources are really important. I always, plan to have more water than you need, just in the event if something goes wrong. Making sure you know your locations of where you're filling. where you're capable of drafting water from, whether it's a water tender, transfer pump, these water locations. Definitely need to know where they're at on the map and how to get water out of them. And clean water is always the best, but I've seen instances where we're getting water out of like a creek or a pond, and then your filter gets clogged up, and then you got to deal with that. So it's not always the best water source to be utilizing. The other thing I talk about is just equipment maintenance, making sure that our equipment is reliable and lasts a long time. Things like frequent oil changes, changing your spark plugs, fuel filters, air filters. We put together kind of a equipment maintenance checklist that we do every year on our pumps, talking about, cleaning it, make sure it looks good, changing oil, spark plugs, um, reading those manuals. If you've never read a manual for your pumps, one thing that I learned early on is when I read the manual was you're actually supposed to close the cylinders on your engines because it helps prevent rusting on them on the inside. So that was something new to me, and I always stress on making sure to do that. The other thing is turning off the fuel. So turn your fuel off when you're not using it. Um, we had an instance where the float gauge and the fuel actually went bad and was leaking fuel all into the engine. And so making sure that fuel was off when we weren't using it is pretty critical. And then testing that equipment before you get out on that burn is important too. Things like this, we normally see hoses that maybe get a little too much heat on them or fire on them, that, something like this probably would work. But if it failed during your prescribed fire, that would be looked upon as like, well, why didn't you get that replaced, while you were in the off season or something like that. The other thing that we saw this year, we had mud daubers get into our air filter, and like, this is just one, but they could build nests all around this thing. And one thing is that if engines can't breathe, they don't work very well. And then from a safety standpoint, when we talk about our Kelly talked about personal safety, but also equipment safety. Know the capabilities of your equipment. Grant talked about, people like to bring their own equipment, which is good. But if you do put somebody new on it, make sure that they know the capabilities of it. Make sure you add fire extinguishers to your equipment. It's a really cheap way to prevent a UTV or truck from burning up. Avoid stuff. I learned this lesson this couple years ago where a water bottle dislodged and got caught behind my accelerator, my brake, caused issues. And then another big one is if you're going interior of these units, if you have a lot of debris built up on your skid plates of your UTV, ATV, or trucks, that could very easily catch fire. So making sure that you get rid of that, clean that out after every burn, check for leaks on your equipment. This looks like a temporary fix, but this is something that having a spare parts available for you to get this fixed would help on some of that. And this is a $20 filter housing that you can get. So having those spare parts is a good thing. Another thing that we put together is just a planning checklist. So if you're planning on a burn, put together kind of just a nice checklist that you can add stuff to, just some of the things to think about. This is going to basically hold yourself accountable and on task when making sure that your fire gets done safely and efficiently. Couple things I just wrap up. I want to talk about lessons learned. So we do have a lessons learned platform for you to share your lessons. So viewers like you can submit lessons for everybody to see. And I think this is kind of a really valuable learning platform for everybody, that we can share our experiences. And so we don't have to learn the hard way. And so we've been utilizing this platform. So if you want to submit a lessons learned, it's in that link that I sent back in the beginning there, but really easy. You can remain anonymous and then submit your state. You can provide your story, your specific lessons learned. You can upload maps, pictures, name it, and we're also entering you into to get a free drip torch if you get picked. But all that gets sent to us, and then basically we take those and then we compile them and put them into our Prescribed Fire Lessons Learned blog. The new issue is going to be released here probably tomorrow, but all the previous issues are on here as well. In this new issue, we talk about our burn this last weekend. Somebody was wearing some frayed pants and they actually caught fire. We talk about air filters, about burning inconsistent fuels to get good downwood black, burning into a previous wildfire or prescribed fire. So it's kind of a pretty cool little way for us to share our stories, even anonymously. And if you have something, I would ask you to submit something, help us continue to kind of teach people and let people learn about all the really cool things and things that are happening across the state. And it doesn't necessarily have to be just prescribed fire related. It could be related to Prescribed Burn Association or a successful prescribed burn that you did and you saw really cool wildlife effects or vegetative effects, or your cattle really enjoyed it. Like anything you want to talk about that is related to prescribed fire is something that you can utilize this platform. So with that, those resources are available. Ooh, was I not sharing that screen?
You weren't, but they have the link.
Okay, sorry. So yeah, so those resources are there and available for everybody to utilize. Here was the lessons learned blog. And this is where you just basically go to share it. It's really simple. You just drop down boxes, add the stuff to it. You can get examples of what we're looking for on that lessons learned blog. So, and in this link tree of the resources, this is where we store all of our information on there. Weather links, checklists, burn plan templates, links to our other trainings and all that stuff on there as well. So, but yeah, so that's kind of all we had. We only went a half hour over, which was pretty good. Does anybody have
Brian,
any?
there was a question in the chat for you
There
that
was.
came in.
Okay. 6-acre burn. We have no experience. How do we get started as beginners? That answer typically involves trying to figure out if there's any burning going on near you and trying to get involved in those fires, because the only way you're really going to learn how to implement fire is by being on fire. So I would suggest trying to seek out your closest prescribed burn association and getting on their list and seeing if you can show up on a couple burns. And if that PBA covers your area, maybe they could come help you. If they don't cover your area, you could always look into trying to start a PBA with your neighbors, or if you get enough experience with that PPA, you can try to do it on your own with your own equipment. Working with your local volunteer fire department is always a good option too to try to do. If you go contact them and ask them about, potentially assisting and helping, that's a good way to do it. But the big thing is just trying to find fires nearby and getting on those. And you can contact us and we can try to get you in with some of those resources, whether it's myself, Ashley, Grant, Rob. We can certainly get you to those. All right. Well, thanks for everybody that stuck around with us, and hopefully you learned something, enjoyed it. Um, we will be posting this at a later date, probably on our YouTube channel, for you to review or share with your friends. So if there are no other questions, we'll see you all later. Thank you.